Good evening, everyone, and welcome to BT's Fly Tying Friday. We're real close to Christmas in 2022, and tonight you're going to be stuck with us tying a few things that we just got leftover materials laying around here, and we'll see what comes out on the hook. We've practiced some of them, and some of them we don't have a clue what's going to turn out, but that's kind of the fun of everything. And tonight we're very fortunate to have Dutch Bachman talk to us about hair softness, hardness, and compression when we get to the weekly tip. So, and it'll also give me a chance to make up from the other week when I did not read his introduction. I've got it here now, so Dutch, we're going to be in business for that. Don't let me forget. Anyway, tonight we're going to be working with leftovers. You know, at the Beatty household, we usually have a pretty nice Sunday dinner, you know, a roast or something like that. And come Monday, there's things left over. That doesn't mean that the dinner on Monday is worse than the dinner on Sunday. It's just it's made out of leftovers and may not be quite the same. And it's no different here in fly tying. Here we are. We've got leftovers. Oh my God. If you could see this place, you would chuckle because I've got a little table sitting here that we had to move in from another room because Gretchen's got stuff stacked on it. We've got that over there that both of us are working from, and that's just the part the camera can catch. The rest of it is, the rest of it's stacked where the camera can't find it. And of course, we've got a whole room full of stuff, but we'll figure out something. But tonight, Gretchen is, well, first off, excitement for me. Maybe not for you, but like 30 years ago, Gretchen came up with this neat new way of tying off a parachute that we've been using ever since. And now, whether we dreamed it up or not, a lot of other people have dreamed it up too. So anyway, we were really tickled with that. And we continued with that for 30 years. And yes, 2 days ago, when we were on one of our sessions where we look like this, and we're both working on things, Gretchen all of a sudden says, "You'll never guess what I just figured out." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Well, you know how we always have a little bit of a tuft of fibers under the parachute when we trim off at the post to get rid of? I just figured out how to get rid of it." Tickled me to death. Now, I know to you all, that's just another turn of thread in a different direction and probably doesn't mean anything to you, but we sure were excited about it. And anyway, Gretchen's going to show you a couple of other things as she ties a parachute. And are you about ready to go?
First off, you can quit talking.
Oh, thank you. But
I'm sorry.
dear, I've got to put a hook in the vise for you.
Oh, yeah.
You want to slide over just a little bit?
Well, yeah, I can talk about this while you do that.
Okay.
One of the things I was trying to think about was what could I use that was kind of hanging out for tails on my parachutes instead of using the mousse like I always did. So people talk about fibers from paintbrushes. So I had this paintbrush and this paintbrush and this paintbrush and this paintbrush. And then I had all my little paintbrushes, my cheapy watercolor paintbrushes. Now I will admit, I did not go to my oil paintbrushes that are made out of natural fibers because they cost too much to use them in fly tying, frankly. So I tied a couple of flies using some of this stuff. And you know what? Don't do it. It just didn't work. I didn't like it. It didn't look good. So then I had to go back to the drawing board. So I decided, I just guess I'm hooked on natural fibers. So I decided to try some squirrel. And the squirrel was good, but it didn't quite have the look I wanted. So I'll show you what I did to make the squirrel do what I wanted it to do or look like I wanted it to do. So I'll do that. I'm going to do, it's a squirrel and calf tail. I'm going to do longitudinal, that's what we call it.
Yeah, longitudinal dubbing.
Longitudinal dubbing, which is using a very inexpensive material. And I'm going to do, of course, my poly parachute. So I think that's all I'm doing that's different today. So
right, except when you get to the point of tying off, we'll get to the.
I can handle it.
Okay, you just tell me what to do. Tell me what you want to do, dear.
I have to give him a hard time sometimes. Okay, so let's go to the vise. as usual, I'm going to start my base wrap at the point where I'm going to be tying my parachute in. Now, in reality, I want my parachute to end right here. So I probably will tie it in. Yeah, right. Well, right back, see, maybe just one turn back so that when I fold it over, it will do what I want it to do. So, because you know it doesn't fold over like sharp like a piece of paper would. It has a bend to it, which pushes it forward a little bit. So got my base wrap. Now I want to tie my tail on a ways back from where I'm going to be tying my post on, because I want to have room so I can blend it, and I'll show you as I go along what I'm going to do. Now, the tricky thing is I tried to use calf tail for what I'm doing, and that just didn't work. So I'm using calf body hair, and you'll find it's finer, straighter, a better match with squirrel. And then we have this squirrel tail. And the only thing I can say about this squirrel tail is it has seen better days, but it still has some good hair on it. It's broken and kind of mangled. So what I'm going to do is take a little bit of that and a little bit of the calf and put them down here on the materials area. I've cleared off just a little space here so you can kind of see what I'm doing. And I don't need very much of either one of the materials. So I want to clean this and get rid of all those short hairs. So I've just got the long,
move forward just a little bit. You're off screen.
the long
There you go.
pristine stuff. And I'll lie that down. And then I'm going to take my calf body hair and take a small chunk of it. And now I'm going to go to the waistband to clean it because it's got some fuzz underneath. Not like the calf tail, but it does have some hairs that you need to get rid of. And then I'm going to put that down here and kind of match the tips. And then I'm not going to just kind of mess with it, see? So it's all kind of folded in together.
What she's tying is kind of a Adam's parachute, and she's mixing up a mixed color tail that will closely look like the hackle around the parachute post.
Okay, there we go. Now I'm going to stack that. I guess I better get over here to stack it, or I'm going to tangle myself up on my hook. Now, normally I put hackle in like this, hair for tails, because it is a little straighter cut, but this was a little different.
She's backing it into the stacker.
Yeah, so now and this takes good beating. Let's pull my glasses down here so I can see what I'm doing. Take it out in the direction you want it on the hook. Okay, there's just a couple little hairs here I'm going to get rid of. That doesn't look too bad.
Did you eat your dinner?
I'm going to measure. I want the length of the shank, put it in place, tie it in. And these holding wraps, I'm putting a lot of pull into them because squirrel does have a tendency to be slippery, and it's one of those hairs that is pretty solid, doesn't flare, so it doesn't always stay on exactly like you want it to. So there we go. There's our mixed tail. Let me just make sure I've got that the right length. Well, it's a little bit long. Let's just pull it out just a tad bit here. It's still not coming out. We all make mistakes. It's just how you correct them. And I don't know if I'm doing that good a job of correcting here.
Okay.
What? Here we go. All right. There's our tail. I think that looks pretty
Looks
good.
pretty good. Yeah.
And see how you've got the mixture of the two. I'm going to cut that at an angle. Now I want to put in what I'm using for the longitudinal dubbing is just, can you go to the back camera?
Yeah.
Let's see, which way do I want to go? There we
There you
go.
go.
Just some red heart yarn, just gray yarn. And what I've done to it is,
Sorry.
oh, there it is. I pulled it apart so that we have just a single strand here. Tie this on. You know what? I don't know why I'm tying that on now, but that's okay. I don't need to. What I need to do first, we'll just put, this is kind of out of order, guys, but it doesn't really matter. Now I'm going to get my poly, if I can find it. This is kind of disconcerting. I've got materials everywhere. And get a bodkin or some sharp instrument and just run through here to straighten it out a little bit. Now you don't really have to measure the post because with poly we can cut it off to length. Now remember I started my base wrap right there, so I'm back about one turn, and that's where I'm going to tie it in.
Yeah, it's rotted.
It's rotted.
I'll throw that spool away.
Okay. I should have known today because when I broke it, I said, I'm not. Let's go this way. Okay, there's our post. I'm going to wrap around that and get it blended in. I want to take one more turn here. That forward just to there we go. Now I'm going to bring my base wrap forward a bit. I'm going to tie a little lump here to kind of stand this up and start wrapping my post. And I'll wrap up, down and around. Now I'll go a little further this time. Notice how I hold on to it. Part of the time, if I didn't, it would, well, I don't think it would now, but it will flop on you if you don't kind of keep the tension right and hold on to it when you've got real tension on it. Okay, so far so good. Now this longitudinal dubbing, what you do is just kind of keep the fibers straight. As you can see, these fibers are kind of straight. So as I wrap, I'll ensure that's the case. Needed to cut some of that off. It was a little bit long. It was getting in the way. There we go. It's better. I think I need to start that back a little bit. It's getting a twist in it, so I'm untwisting it. What I like about this particular skein of yarn is it's kind of modeled it a little bit in its coloration. And it makes a really nice stripy look. Okay, and I tied that off. So there we got the body. When I first did this today, the hackle I had, the brown hackle I had was too dark and it kind of just took away from the look. So I found this nice light colored brown. So I'm going to mix that with some grizzly. Let's see, here we go. Let's see where I want to start that about. I'm going to get rid of it about from this point back. Now I want the stem, bare stem, enough bare stem to go up to this point where I'm going to start wrapping the hackle, and then I will wrap down. There we go.
Gretchen, are both those hackles facing the same way or are they in opposite directions?
Facing the same way. I've tried it the other way, and I just don't like the way it looks because I like the hackle to kind of cup down like this onto the water. And if you do it with the shiny side down, one is going to be sticking up, and I
Gotcha.
just don't care for it that way. It's probably just a personal preference. I don't think that it really matters, probably. I'm going to trim this off and wrap this back. Tie it off. Well, I didn't tie it off, did I? Let me wrap it around here. This is the best way to do this. Fine with this yarn, you're better if you wrap the thread around the yarn and then come up and over to tie it off because it somehow seems to have the ability to escape. There we go. Now I'm going to take my thread, wrap up to the top of the post, and then I'm going to catch my hackle, wrap back down, leave it hanging. One of the things that's interesting is somehow when I tie hackle on a post, it always seems to want to go on the opposite direction. So what I do in order to make sure the shiny side is up, is I'll take a little motion this way, kind of down and towards me, and that seems to, well, look, see, that one's still being a bad boy. No, it isn't. That's good. All right. That seems to help it come the way I want it to. Al asked me today if I wrapped both of them at once or separately. And I thought it was, first of all, I thought it was interesting that you didn't know.
Well, I know what you do when you're not doing a mixed tackle, but I wasn't sure. Now, are you ready to do the tie off? I'm going to zoom in.
I'm ready to do the tie off. So now I've got my hackle wrapped. I'm going to take my thread and bring it between the hackle and the shank, hold it down, and take 2 wraps like that. Now, this is usually when we used to cut the hackle off and then try to tuck it in. But what I started doing yesterday or today or whenever it was, I figured this out. I bring it, I can't get tangling with the camera here. Just a minute, I'll shorten my thread so the camera won't be a problem. I'm going to bring it back here and hold the hackle up so I'm coming under it. And I'm going to do that twice.
We used to cut it off and try to tuck that cut off end up, and she finds that she gets a better, cleaner look by tucking it up first and then trimming it.
Now I can go back under here. I think you can they see that?
Yeah.
I can't see the monitor, so I can't see what I'm doing there. Now, if you look at that, you cannot find that little tag end at all. It's just a really clean cut. And then come forward. And half hitch tool. Thank you. When I tie at Al's station, he always has to hand me the tools because I can never find them for some reason. 1 wrap is a half hitch. 2 or more wraps are a whip finish. Cut the thread. This is the point where I would measure my wing. I think it's a little bit long. It looks better. And then drop of glue right there. That's my parachute. Any
Thank you, Gretchen.
questions?
Back at the vise. We're going to talk a little bit more about longitudinal dubbing. For one thing, mixing hackle fiber tails and all that type of stuff. And I'll be doing the same thing that Gretchen did, a mixed tail, and talking a little bit more about longitudinal dubbing and where the name came from and all that type of stuff. But like Gretchen, I am going to start my thread at 1/3 position on the hook shank. Couple of turns, and I'm going to wrap back about halfway and stop. One of the things that's really a problem, maybe not so much today. Yeah, it is today, because even with all the genetic hackle, it's really difficult to find good grizzly long tailing fibers. And in fact, tonight I'm going to use some grizzly tailing fibers that I drew out of the trash bin from stuff that we tied the last couple of days on our other gig that we're doing on Facebook. And this is a piece, like I said, I threw it away. It's from the waist end of the feather. And I'm going to turn it into a dry fly tail. Did this a bunch of thousands of times back in the day before we could get good stuff. What we could get is we could get some good India bigger hackle, but the India capes just didn't have much grizzly in it. Well, I'm going to show you how to do something that we did back in the early 80s, where we would mix squirrel tail with really poor quality grizzly to come up with an Adam's tail. And so I'm going to start out looking for some pretty good squirrel tail here. And what I need to look for is squirrel tail that isn't got a lot of broken tips. Some of the squirrel tail, especially if it's from a wild squirrel, they tend to have tips that are pretty well
Are there
broken.
domestic squirrels?
I don't know whether there is or not, but I know ours used to be wild until Gretchen's father trapped them and turned them into fly tying materials for us. That's a nice way of saying he killed them. And there's a broken tip, and the rest of those all look pretty straight and not too broken. There's one right there. And so I'm going to just slip them into my stacker and stack them. Slide those in backwards into the stacker. And I'll reach off on the side here and get them all tapped even there. And what this produces is a fairly sturdy tail that, especially when you're getting into the sizes 12s and smaller, you can't tell it from hackle fibers, but it supports the really lousy grizzly quite well. And I'm just going to make this tail about as long as the hook. And I'm going to tie this on with a couple of thread wraps, cinch it down tight, but I am not going to wrap all the way to the end of the shank. There's a reason for that, and I'll show you why in just a moment here. Now we'll grab this really webby grizzly. And it's not too bad on the tips. Well, it's lousy. That's why it got thrown away in the first place. And as I say, I took it out of the trash bin, and I'll just get those fibers all lined up and pull the feather away from the fibers, so I end up with them still pretty well stacked. And I'm going to set those in place right on top and tighten up. Now, what I want to do is kind of blend that a little bit. And the easiest way I found to blend them is to kind of split them with your thumbnail, reach up, pull up, and then just start wrapping towards the bend of the hook. Does that mix them perfectly? No, but most of the flies you find today in the fly shop, the mixture is one on top of the other, and that's it.
You know, I bet it would have been easier if I had done my squirrel tail and calf tail that way too.
That could be. It just,
Because
I
it was
did-
kind, it's kind of
I
fussy
didn't even, when
you-
we were talking about it today, I didn't even think about it
Yeah.
until I sat down and started to tie these. And I said, oh, well, that's the way I used to do it. Well, anyway, what we're going to do is I'm going to tie in Adams again I'm going to use a poly wing. But this time I've taken a piece of poly, and where Gretchen took the whole bundle to tie the fly that she did, I am going to, I'm just going to take a portion of it, get any of these stray fibers that look causing me troubles and get rid of them. And that looks good. And I'm just going to lay them on top of the hook. And crisscross them in place as if I were tying on dumbbell eyes or something like that. So you can see that that's just what I've done right there. What I like about this particular method is you eliminate bulk in the body, and you don't have to worry so much about covering it up. And now right in behind there, I'm going to wrap some additional thread to fill in my underbody so that when I do my longitudinal dubbing, I have a underbody that's pretty well even all the way from front to back. Now, one of the things that I want to do is I'm going to pull these up and measure them for length. And I've already got a hook here pulled out for another fly, and I'll just use the shank as a measurement tool. So I'm going to pull those fibers up, bring the hook in there, get an idea where I need to cut it. It's right about there. And get rid of it. And now I have a divided set of wings. Now they're still just a little bit long. It's always better to cut them a little long than it is short. It's real tough to add to the materials that you cut off in air. All right, now that's looking pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is, where this is kind of flat out, I've kind of pushed it up, but it's just going to go flat again. And if I were tying a spent wing spinner type of a fly, I'd want that to happen, but I want these to stand up. So I'm just going to wrap, if I were in my Boy Scout class right now, this is what they call frapping. And all I'm doing there is putting some wraps that'll pull those wings up. And I'll trim off a little bit more there now that I've got them sitting in place. There we go. I've got a wild hair here. All right, now I'm going to take a piece of this yarn and tell you a little bit about longitudinal dubbing. It came from my telephone days. One of the guys I worked with was a cable splicer. His name was Dale Kitt, and we worked together in Sandpoint. And he came to me one day saying, I want to show you something that I've been doing on the flies that I tie. And I said, okay, well, let's see it. He says, I call it longitudinal dubbing. And just so you can understand where the name comes from, at the time in the telephone industry, without getting too technical, part of our line balancing equipment was a longitudinal blocking coil. I'm not even going to try to explain to you what it does, but anyway, that was the name of it. And you know how your day-to-day work can kind of sneak into your hobby, and that's exactly what happened here. Is he thought, well, longitudinal is, we'll give it a try with the dubbing, and that's what he did. Now I want you to notice that I've got the dubbing here, and I'm just going to drop it. I'm going to reach over instead and get my hackle out, because one of the things that I really like on my divided wing flies that are not parachutes, of course the parachutes do have it as well, is I like to have dubbing under my hackle. I don't say that it's right or wrong. I just like the way that looks. That's on my personal flies. And when they're my personal flies, I guess I can do it that way. Now I'm going to select hackle, and whenever you mix hackle, if you're not wrapping a parachute, and I want you to notice Gretchen didn't explain it in a lot of detail, but when she selected her brown and her grizzly, she had a fairly well marked piece of grizzly and a medium brown, which could even be called medium ginger, or even tending towards a darker ginger as her mixing color. Well, one of the things that you can have trouble with when mixing brown and grizzly is that the brown, if it's anywhere dark at all, it's going to overpower the color of the grizzly. And it'll look like you haven't put any grizzly on at all if you have a 50% mix of your two colors. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm just going to pick one of the feathers here. There's one right there. I'll just pull him out, put the rest of those away, and take a look at it. And what you have to do with a lot of experience, you can look at the grizzly and you can look at the brown and decide what percentage do I need of one to the other to get my hackle application to turn out looking the same. And understand, as a commercial tyer, your goal is to turn out a bin full of flies for a fly shop that all look the same. Not a really good looking one to go under glass, or 2 or 3 really good looking ones to go in your fly box, but you want 50 dozen that look the same. And so you have to make calculations that every time you look at a brown feather and a grizzly feather, of what percentage mix do we need. And on this one, there's a semi darker brown here. Let me see. Let me open up the fibers just a little bit. Yeah, that's a pretty dark. And so I'm going to need probably about a 60-40 mix on this to get a good mix between my grizzly and brown. And I'll show you how we'll do that here in just a minute. But right now, what I'm going to do, because I'm going to dub under the hackle, is I'll tie the hackle on before. And I like both of the feathers with the shiny side forward. I know that some people say they should be the dull side forwards. Some say it should be one of each. And I like it with the shiny side.
And the fish
forward.
really do care a lot about which side
They
is
look and they
forward.
say, Al didn't put those feathers on right. I won't bite that fly. I mean, I've seen this happen. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge for sale in Brooklyn too.
We used to tie for the fisherman, for the shop owner. Actually.
Yeah, we tie for the customer request. All right, I'll just finish that with a little bit of a whip finish there. Now let's talk about longitudinal dubbing for a minute. The process requires straightening these fibers. And I want you to notice that. Can you do a zoom in on this, Gretch? There we go. You tell me if they can see it or not. Yeah. I am going to twist this strand until they see right there, those fibers all lined up. If you go that way, they're not lined up anymore. There's a little twist in them. I don't know if that's showing up on camera or not.
It is.
Okay, good. So I'm going to start wrapping my dubbing in place. After I learned this trick from a cable splicer at the phone company, I was working on commercial orders at the time. And anyway, I had an order of gray wolves to deliver to a fly shop. And I hadn't tied them yet. I had done the wings and tails, but I had not done the bodies yet. It's something that we do a lot of, is we work ahead on fly orders, doing part of the fly at a time. I want you to see what I'm doing right now as I'm just working my dubbing in there. But anyway, so I delivered this order, I think it was 50 dozen gray wolves to this fly shop in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. First time I delivered to this particular guy, it was right after I had moved from California to Idaho, and I was building up my customer base with local fly shops. He says, "How in the heck do you get your dubbing delay so flat?" And I said, "Well, it's longitudinal dubbing." He says, "Where do you buy that?" And I said, "Well, it's at Kmart." Well, and then I showed him the trick. But for a minute, I had the shop owner go in there for a minute. I want you to notice that I kind of pulled that back over and I'll just throw a half hitch in there so I don't lose it all. Nothing more embarrassing than talking with all of you guys and losing the fly in the middle. Now I'm going to start wrapping my brown first. One of the ways that you increase the turns of hackle of one color or the other is which one is the one that makes the first turn at the back and the last turn at the front. Well, that's 2 turns of hackle more than the other fly has if you had wrapped them both at the same time. So I'm going to wrap the brown first. And I'll take 2 turns behind the wing, a turn in front, and I'll just keep advancing my way forward until I get almost up to the hook eye, but I'm not there yet. I am going to tie this one off because what I want to do with this feather, or this feather, is tie it off. And I'm going to even not worry about trimming it real close. I'm just going to leave a little stub sticking up there because it's going to be hidden by the second feather. It's going to be wrapped now. Remember, we had 2 turns of brown behind. We've got 3 turns behind. And now I'm going to be filling in as I go forward with the spaces I left from the. Now my feather's getting short. I could grab a hackle pliers or I'll just bring it around and hold it with my finger. Now the last turn is going to be in front of the brown, anchored off right there at the hook eye. And what that does now is it gives me a nice even mix of grizzly brown hackle, but it's not an even mix. As you can see, I've got about 4 more turns of grizzly in that fly than I have of brown. And let's throw a whip finish in there. And we'll just trim off the waist. Straighten my wings out. So there is a totally fake Adams. It doesn't have brown hackle fibers in the tail. It's got poly wings instead of the hackle point wings. And I want you to notice that the mix of the grizzly brown is fairly even, but it's definitely not 50-50. And that's because of the color.
The intensity, I guess, is even, not the
Yeah, for sure. Now,
turns.
before we go into the weekly tip and all this stuff, I want to talk about some other things that you can do with materials. And in fact, we're going to start with this one right here. And every one of you has seen this particular fly and style of fly that we've demonstrated many, many times with Wonder Wings. And we've even written a book about Wonder Wings. Well, to talk about the Wonder Wings for a minute, I can tell you that there probably wasn't 3% of the flies that would show up in a fly shop that had anything that even looked like a Wonder Wing back in the 80s. And in the 90s, I run into the Wonder Wings in Europe and loved them, brought them home, and started tying with them. Now, after a bunch of years of tying flies commercially, I had 863 capes with all of the size 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, and 18 feathers pulled out of them, and all the big stuff at the one end. Well, what do? You only can tie so many woolly worms or woolly buggers, and what do you do with the rest of the feathers? I didn't know what to do, but I was too cheap to throw the darn things away. After I learned about the Wonder Wing, I started talking them up and showing them around the fly shops. Well, bottom line is, by the end of the 90s, which was, well, let's say 5-6 years, those 863 capes were gone. And now we're buying saltwater capes to use to tie our Wonder Wings. And so it is a place where we made do with the material we had lots of leftovers on and didn't know what to do with it. And we found a place for it. And we'll go back to that. The Wonder Wing. It's an absolutely gorgeous wing. But it took a long darn time to get fly shop owners to accept it because they didn't know whether their customers would accept it. Well, now here is another thing that I've done a few times. Let me get rid of this one. I cannot tell you how many muddlers I've tied. And I didn't have a matched set of quill wings to tie it. Well, that one right there is tied out of one piece of feather, one feather slip off of one turkey tail. As you can see, that's the other side. And what I've done is very delicately, number one, I put a light squirrel tail wing under the quill wings. And then I folded a big wide slip of turkey tail and cut one side off because they didn't match up. But they match up now. And I can't tell you how many dozens I've sold through fly shops where the tail and the wing were tied out of those. Now here's another thing. I've only done this particular type of thing on my personal flies. There's one fly that we fish a lot of. It's called the Payette River Special, one we made up ourselves. You probably don't even know what it looks like, but it's tied out of wings that are from goose shoulder. That's a goose shoulder wing right there. And all we did is 2 slips off of at the same spot on the feather, pull the right one over the top of the left one and tie them on. Are they perfect? No. Do they fish? Yep. And if that's what you have in your inventory, remember what we're talking about is making do with leftovers. And now for the weekly tip, we'll be talking about hair hardness, softness, and compressibility. Yeah, and I've been looking forward to this because I'm going to make up for a mistake that I made here several weeks ago. But tonight, for the first time ever, we're going to have one of you all provide the weekly tip. Tonight it's going to be Dutch Bachman. Dutch Bachman began his fly tying journey in 1957. Having no supplies, he tied his first fly on an old rusty hook, thread from Mama's sewing basket, a feather found on the ground, and hair cut from his dog. What was the dog's name, Dutch?
Snowball.
Oh, God. Oh, the Snowball Special. I can see it now. The fly was magnificent. Since that time, he has been mentored by Michael Redinsich and Wayne Llewellyn, tied with many exceptional tyers, and is a proud member of the Roadkill Roundtable fly tying group. It's a group that's been tying on a regular basis since 1972. Dutch is also a proud life member of FFI Fly Tying Group and a recipient of the Dick Nelson Fly Tying Award and the Darwin Atkin Fly Tying Award. And tonight, Dutch is going to have the tip. And the tip he's going to talk about, if it's all right with you, Dutch, I will share get that up here. And okay, when you're done with this, then Dutch, you can go ahead. And this is the information that Dutch sent me about hair softness, hardness, and compressibility. Dutch, it's all yours.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. From our conversation last week, you were mentioning concern many tyers have to work with squirrel, because the feeling is that squirrel is slippery and very difficult to tie in as a wing. That occurred to me years ago, and I was very curious about why would that be? Why would deer hair or fox or something else be so easy to use, but another species more difficult to use? And I won't go into all the detail, but every species, every animal has characteristics that are unique to that particular species. And it's absolutely true with their hair. And in particular with squirrel, they have some configuration in their actual hair that causes like a little scale on their hair fiber that causes it to feel slick. And so for the longest time, I thought, well, that's why it's hard to to tie in as a wing. And when I say it's hard to tie in as a wing, you could really crank it down on the hook shank, and as soon as you tied it off, you could reach in the middle of the bundle and pull out the middle of the bundle. And very, very, very frustrating. And I watched them come apart in the river and that type of thing. So it got to be very frustrating, and I had to figure this thing out. So what I discovered was that different animal hairs do in fact have characteristics that make them easier to tie in as a hair wing or not. And what I discovered with some research on this is that it comes down to a matter of compressibility, and specifically whether or not the hair fiber is soft or the hair fiber is hard. And we know that some animal hairs seem to be a little more hollow and that type of thing. And when we translate that information into floatability and those kinds of things that are important to fly tires. But the compressibility issue is a very real thing. And the easiest way to think about this is that some animal hair is soft and some animal hair is hard. Examples of, well, I sent out a list that I compiled. No serious empirical data, just experiments that I conducted over time, trying different types of animal hair to determine what type of hair worked best or worked well for a wing. And then as I continued to study this, I discovered that those particular hairs that work best are in fact softer fiber hairs, and they compress better. So the whole idea is to be able to cut a bundle of hair off a hide to the proper size or volume, and use some method to tie that onto a hook shank, crank it down the best of our ability, and hoping that that will hold that bundle in place. But for the hair that's soft, it will compress with the actual wrap and tightening of the thread wrap around it. So the list that I sent out is some of what you see on this screen here, but I have a continuum. For example, I believe that Arctic hare and deer, bucktail, butt ends, skunk, gray fox, elk body, moose body, those are all very, very soft hairs. They compress very, very well. Kid goat hair, calf tail at the bottom 2/3 of the tail, black bear. And as I went down that continuum, it seemed to me that each next animal species might be a little harder in material. So that list helped me understand that some hair will compress better than others. Clearly, at the hard end of the continuum is red or gray squirrel, pine squirrels, and that Douglas squirrel. They're all in that same category. So it's the fact that it does in fact have characteristics. Squirrel hair has characteristics that do in fact make it slippery. It's the fact that it's a hard hair and does not compress well that makes it difficult to work with when we're trying to dress it as a wing on a fly pattern. What I've concluded from all of this is that, and I should also add, there's some other hairs that I've worked with that I should add to, like Finnish raccoon. Anytime I come across a hair, I test it to see where it might fall in this continuum. But in any case, what I've concluded from all of this is that there's a couple key things about the thread that I'm using, and there's a couple key things about the hair itself. For example, on the thread, on the hair, what I attempt to do when I'm using squirrel is make sure that the bundle that I've cut is absolutely clean. Meaning I'll take extra time to make sure that all the fur is out of the bundle that I cut, and all I have remaining are the guard hairs. I'll go to all kind of time. I'll take a lot of time to make sure that the hair bundle is clean. The other thing I've learned about squirrel is that as compared to other types of hair, animal hair, my squirrel wings tend to be a little more sparse than some of the softer hair that I'll put on a wing. So when I tie a pattern that requires a squirrel wing, a hair wing, I make sure the length is measured properly and it's what length it needs to be. But typically the volume or the size of the squirrel bundle is probably a little more sparse than other types of hair. And as far as the thread, I think thread control is a distinction within the art of fly tying. I think one thing that distinguishes fly tying or fly tyers is the skills they develop, in particular to thread control and how to use those skills when necessary. So for example, whenever I'm going to use squirrel as a hair wing, I will make certain I'm using a polyester thread as opposed to a nylon. Oftentimes I'll use a GSP thread, but typically it's only going to be a polyester or a GSP type of thread. And I have specific techniques that I like to use specific to squirrel. For example, a couple weeks ago, I think I tied the rusty rat and it had a gray fox hair wing, and I used a double pinch loop method to capture the wing and compress it as I tied it onto the top of the hook shank. And with squirrel, that'll be my first choice. I will the first technique I'll use with squirrel will be the double pinch loop method to secure it to the top of the hook shank, because that technique is actually designed for the two loops in the pinch wrap to actually compress around the bundle before it even gets to the hook shank. So that has optimal opportunity to compress the bundle. I like to use also the layered method to tie in squirrel, which means I'll cut the bundle of hair I'm going to use. And another thought I always have when I'm tying is I like to prepare every piece of material I possibly can before I take it to the hook shank. I try to minimize the amount of material cutting I do once material is on the hook shank. And that holds true with hair wings. So I'll measure the length that I need, and I'll cut the butt end so that I'm securing, holding and tightening the butt ends of that bundle in a very small bundle instead of a lot of butt hairs I have to cut off later. So if I'm not going to use the double pinch loop method, I like to use a layered method, which means you cut your bundle, you hold it in place at the tie-in spot, compress it the best you can so it's a little more vertical, and then you actually lay your thread in the bottom third of the bundle, go around the hook shank, pull straight up and tighten that one down really good. The next thread wrap goes about the middle part of that bundle around the hook shank, tighten it down very well. The third wrap will be at the top third of that bundle around the hook shank, tighten it down. Another method I'll use sometimes, it's I don't know if there's a formal name for it, but I think of it as a reverse method, in that I'll tie the squirrel hair in so the tips are actually extending over the hook eye. I tie the butt end of the squirrel bundle at the spot where it needs to be, and I'll tie it in snugly, but then I'll take the tip end of the bundle and fold it back over itself and tie that in again on top of the butts that I already tied in. That tends to splay the wing a little bit, or actually much more than the double pinch loop method. But it'll keep a squirrel tail in place. And a variation of the layered method, I think, is what's thought of as a stacked method, which means you prepare the bundle of squirrel hair that you're going to use for the wing, and you take like a third of that and tie it in. Then you take the next third of the bundle and tie it on top of the first third. Then you tie in the final third on top of the first two. They're all tied in at the same place. And it's very similar to what I described in the layered method, but that seems to hold the fibers in place pretty well. Another thing I've learned from tying salmon flies is that when I'm holding squirrel spatially in place, I'll hold the material with my thumb and middle finger instead of my thumb and index finger. The pads on my middle finger and thumb are more compatible and spread wider when they're compressed together. And that translates into holding the material a little better in place. So one thing I like about that is that when I hold that material in place like this, when that configuration is on top of the hook shank, as you can see, I've got an O right here. And as I'm tying in the wing, I can look into that O and I can actually see the angle of the wing and making certain that it's not being canted to one side or the other. But most importantly to me is I want to make sure it maintains that angle. So keeping that angle by looking through the O at the same time I'm using one of those methods to tie in the butt ends has improved significantly the results of tying in a squirrel wing that is the proper angle and it's secure. Al, I don't want to ramble on with this, but I'd be glad to explain anything in more detail if anybody has a question.
We already have one request to have you back to do nothing but demo this stuff, and I'm in favor of that.
Okay, all right.
Well, that's the BTs here for you every Friday night. Thanks for joining us. But for tonight, that's a wrap. Join us in another week.